Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Entrepreneurship Digital Dialogue, discussing innovation during a crisis. My name is Scott Azaroff, and I am the Charlotte Alumni Network President and the moderator for today's webinar. What we're going to focus on today is entrepreneurship perspective on the importance of innovation and flexibility, taking care of your team, and staying mission-driven during challenging times. A few things before we get started, just some housekeeping items, just so everyone knows how to participate in today's event. So at any point in time during the webinar, you guys will have the ability to submit a question to the presenters. To do so, please type your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. The chat feature is disabled, so please use the Q&A. And as time permits, our presenters will get to as many questions as we can during that Q&A. And one last item, the webinar will be recorded and we will share the link after the event. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's speakers. So first, we're going to hear from Steve Hall, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Commissioner of the American Ultimate Disc League and Managing Partner of EHF Capital. After Steve, we'll be hearing from Andy Horwitz, who served as the co-CEO of Black Mountain Systems for over 10 years and is now an active investor, board member, and advisor to tech-enabled companies in the US and Europe. I hope you guys enjoy the webinar, and I will turn it over to Steve to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Scott. Let me share screen with everybody here. We'll get all this teed up. So, and not only thank you, Scott, but thank you to Emory for allowing Andy and I to share some stories with you all today. So we are going to talk about 6 pillars and talk about them as you think about navigating a crisis. Again, the focus is on innovation and innovate not only to survive a crisis, but really to be able to thrive in a crisis. And so I think you hopefully will get two very different perspectives today. I think Andy and I come at this from different walks of life, and I think that's going to be helpful to you all. And again, the goal this evening is really to provide some real life experiences of where Andy and I have succeeded, but also candidly probably have learned some lessons or relearned some lessons that we've gone through over our careers. And I think what is always helpful to me is to kind of have a picture in my mind. It's worth 1,000 words, and hopefully we won't have 1,000 words tonight, but I think having a picture in your mind will kind of frame the comments we're going to make. And the one I like to have is that pretty traditional, that the captain on the old ship, where you've got the big circular wheel and there's a storm blowing, you've got rain, you've got wind coming in, but that captain is holding on to that wheel, and that captain looks so calm and cool. And I think whether you're a CEO, whether you're someone who's been in a business for a few years or whether you're an intern, I think being able to kind of keep that calm, cool, and collected persona while you're trying to innovate through a crisis is really important, because there's a lot going on behind you and around you. You've got to be flexible, and we'll talk about that, but I think keeping calm and cool through all this will really help you in general of navigating the crisis. So the first pillar we want to talk about is being flexible and agile. But before we get into that, I want to give you a little bit of context and what is the American Ultimate Disc League, because I think that'll help kind of frame this for you all. Hopefully you all are familiar with Ultimate is. A lot of us have seen the Frisbees flying around campus around the quad. And Ultimate's been around since the late 60s. It was started up in North Jersey. It's been kind of a college sport that you can create a lifestyle around. A lot of people play it into their 50s. And the American Ultimate Disc League was formed in 2012. It's a professional Ultimate Disc League, believe it or not. It is pro. And we have 22 teams in North America, 3 in Canada, 19 in the US, stretching from Seattle to San Diego to Tampa up to Montreal. And we have about 800 players. We play 12 home games or 12 games from April and through July, and have a championship weekend Final Four style in August. And so, the players are weekend warriors. They have day jobs, but they are great athletes, and they put on a good show. So as you can imagine, we were very excited about 2020 in January, February. All of a sudden, this thing called COVID starts to creep up in March, and we start all having questions about whether we can start the league in April. And as you can imagine, it absolutely snowballed from there. And we got to a point of saying, wow, we're actually going to probably have to cancel our season. Can we pull it off in a bubble? What do we do? And so, as I mentioned, this first pillar, we are live entertainment. And, that made it really, really tough to pull off our business. And so to that first pillar, you have to be flexible and agile. So many times we go into our businesses saying, we have a strong mission, we have a strong vision, we know what we think we want to accomplish, but all of a sudden, you get the proverbial curveball. And I think that's probably the number one pillar that I always keep in mind is no matter how confident you are in your business plan, you have to know that as an entrepreneur and someone who's probably in the beginning part of their business cycle, that you have to be flexible. Things are not going to go the route that you expected. There's going to be lots of twists and turns. So for us, practically speaking, what did that mean for us? Well, with a season that was canceled, we had to say, well, people are looking for content. And I think we all probably sat in front of our television saying, well, there's no live sports content. What are we going to watch? And we all got hit with, the reruns, the best of championships, a great game, a great match of some kind. And that's what we learned to do is to say, well, we are live entertainment, but first and foremost, we're content. We're video content that people can enjoy. And so, let's recycle some of that content. How do we take great clips, put those clips together? And we even created something for outside of North America, which was kind of an ultimate greatness series, where instead of a 2.5-hour championship game from 2017 that we might want to show to the North American audience, hey, why don't we cut this down to 58 or 52 minutes, put some ads around it, and show it to a whole new audience who maybe hadn't been presented to this content in the past. And so it's actually a way for us to start to pivot in our business and think about that new audience and really use old content, but maybe in a new way. I think part of being flexible and agile is to have confidence to really go back to sometimes a blank sheet of paper to say, well, again, what business are we truly in? Some people say, well, we're in the ultimate Frisbee business. Well, no, not really. We're in the entertainment business. And if we can create content that's entertaining, well, you can monetize that and you can have a good client base. So I think that's the first pillar I wanted to mention. The second is passion and perseverance. The issue that we obviously had to address here this past year is the public wondering, well, are you as a professional sports league going to survive? I think people are asking that of the NBA. They certainly asked that of MLB when they started to really struggle with their COVID issues. And it's part of that picture where we talk about that captain on the boat, that even though you look calm and cool, you still have to show the passion in that business. You have to show the passion to the rest of your colleagues that, you're excited about your business, that you see a way forward. You can envision the path through the storm. And I think it's important to, as you're innovating, is to talk about the future. And again, as you think about being flexible, you may have to talk about new concepts that, the future is bright, but we may have to be creative and come up with some new, new kinds of content, new kinds of product or services that we could offer. And I think that, we all like new things, even though some of us are creatures of habit and like, have our comfort zones. I think we all get excited when we talk about new concepts and new ideas. And you, I think, as a leader in your business, again, whether you're a leader at the CEO level, whether you're head of a business unit, or even if you're an intern, I think as you show passion and you talk about being able to persevere through these crises, that gets people excited around you. And I think that's really important. And even if sometimes it's a wild idea, I think that's okay. We have certainly engaged and energized people in our organization to say, well, we had been delivering a form of content to the North American audience. What else can we do? What are the kind of content can we create? And I'll talk about that a little bit later in leveraging technology. And so the next pillar is access to capital. It's great when you've got your team energized, thinking about new content, and boy, where could we go with this future? And that's all nice, but certainly if you're in a CEO role, or certainly if you're in a CFO role, you know that cash is king. And boy, if the money runs out, you are in deep trouble. I think for all of us who have taken a business from literally, the back of the napkin to maybe even something that was a pretty good business plan, that we realize that, you've got to have cash, whether you're investing in marketing, whether you're paying people salaries, you've got to have cash. And I think we all know, and we can shake our heads saying, yes, of course, Steve, cash is important. But I think it comes down to knowing that, cash is something you don't think about for the next month. You don't think about it for the next quarter. But really, I think as we have all learned, and Andy, I certainly as investors in businesses, know that you want to really think about 2 years worth of cash. That's kind of my rule of thumb. You don't want to be running out and trying to grab cash, every 6 months, every year. You would like to have, cash for 2 years worth of burn. Sometimes that's easy to say, but I think these crises that we go through, whether it's a COVID, whether there's some kind of potentially regulatory disruption in your business, it just makes you realize that, if you can go out and grab cash, it's great to grab as much as you can. Sometimes you have to be humble. I think a lot of us get caught up in thinking, well, goodness, if I have to give up an extra 5 or 10% to my company, boy, I really don't want to have to do that. And, as we remind people that, 100% of nothing is obviously a lot lower than 50% of something north of zero. And so sometimes you have to swallow your pride and take that extra cash because, boy, right now, you'd probably be willing and very happy to give up 5 or 10% of your business, for, the chance to survive something like this, which, we all hope maybe be 6 months, but, COVID could take us 12 to 18 months to get through. So the fourth pillar I want to mention is human capital. I mentioned it earlier in terms of your teams and getting them excited, but I think that especially in COVID, it's not about getting people excited about the future. Sometimes it's getting people through the day. And I think COVID is a great example of a crisis that hits us in many different ways. It's not just, hey, are we going to have enough clients? Hey, are we going to have enough revenue to be successful? But people are really hurting mentally. They have friends who could be in the hospital. They could have family who is in the hospital and, in the ICU. And I think, again, as that leader, when you're on that ship looking around, you've got to be very aware of that person who has their head down, sitting, really nervous. It may not be that they're concerned about, getting their tasks done for that particular day. They may be really hurting. And I think that's really important to empathize. We're spending a lot more time now, especially with the owners of our teams, saying, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How are things going? How can we help? A lot of those how questions, and you've got to take people's temperature. And again, I think it's even more important in today's world, not just, again, pushing people to see how many tasks can they get done? Are you pushing them too hard to succeed with your business plan? But, are they hurting for different reasons outside of the business? And that's important. Hopefully we're getting more emotive in today's world, but that's something that you always want to double check on. As I said, empathy overcomes a lot. And that's important. It's for some of us, I'm an engineer by undergrad training. That's, I think, genetically difficult for me. And sometimes I have to remind myself and put notes to just reach out and ask people how they're doing every once in a while. The fifth is leveraging technology. And I have the issue is when you're in these crises, can you be more efficient? Can you be smarter? What are the tools that are out there? And I think technology is a general tool that we're all trying to use in better ways. And as the note, you'll see humans are complicated. I just talked about, human capital, and where, clearly, we can't have companies that are just pure robots. And you have to have humans to execute your business plan, but boy, we sure are complicated. And there are a lot of times when we wish we could just have an algorithm, artificial intelligence, a robot do a lot of these things, because robots are not going to complain. They're probably not likely to break down as much as we all do as humans, but they're obviously limited. However, how can we be smarter? So, we really looked at this live entertainment business, and we said, how can we leverage social media? How can we get short content? Could be in some other things, or may not pan out in terms of these 10 minutes of video content. But we have certainly looked again in our business to say, TikTok. Especially for someone who's 50 years old, my boys were saying, "Dad, what in the world are you doing on TikTok? You're way too old." But we laughed, and I said, well, it's a way to get our content out to new audiences, the younger audiences. And we have to be thoughtful. Again, how do we take 2 hours worth of video content and cut it down to 5-second clips, 10-second, 30 or 60-second clips? And whether we're rolling that out on Instagram or TikTok, we realize that, leveraging social media as a technology is critically important to really staying in touch with our fan base. They are happy to see, old clips of people, great layouts. And to be honest, ESPN and other big media channels that are helpful for us to just get out to broader audiences, they were looking for new, interesting content that was put together. And so, some of this can be silly, some of this can be fun, some of this can be serious. But, you have to be, again, innovative in the way you use technology. And again, if it wasn't kind of a core tool, again, be flexible, step back, and think about how you can do some new things. The last one I want to talk about is leveraging networks. And I mean that more on the human side than, leveraging networks from a technology perspective. And so, as you're the captain of the ship riding out the storm, I think if you looked around, there's a lot, there are other ships in that sea. Everyone's going through these same, that same storm. And, I think there's a lot of times that we feel like we're on an island, and we get, the blinders on, just worrying about the issues that we're dealing with in our own business. But I think that's really the time, again, whether you're CEO, whether you're head of a business, whether you're an intern, it's the time to reach out. Whether you're grabbing coffee, whether you're having a Zoom meeting, whether you're grabbing drinks, of course, socially distanced with everybody, it's the time to ask, hey, what's going on in your business? I think there's a lot of sharing that's going on right now, which is great. I think people's elbows are a little less sharp than they've been in the past, potentially. And, it's sometimes tough to say, hey, listen, I'm struggling as a business. I'm thrashing around looking for new ideas. And you've got to have that confidence to reach out for help because, you may feel like you're being innovative, but you know what? Someone else may have come up with a new idea. Let's share. And I think as we all as a community are helping each other get through COVID and these other crises, again, physically, mentally, from a business standpoint, I think people are all kind of linking arms and saying, hey, let's find ways to help. So, there's a lot of networks that are already kind of in place for CEOs, for other people, whether it's by gender, by race, by type of company. That's great. Those are terrific to have, but also, reach out to other people in your personal network. And again, you've got to have the confidence to ask for help sometimes. So that's kind of my quick kind of insights from the American Ultimate Disc League, a little bit of context around what we're going through. We'll have a Q&A later, and happy to go into more details. But right now, let me turn it over to Andy, and I think he's going to give you a lot of great insights, but from a very different business perspective. So bear with me here while I stop sharing my screen and hand over to Andy. All yours.
Awesome. All right. Let's see. Perfect. Are you seeing my screen now, Steve?
Yes, Andy, I am. It's got everything, the main slide, but also the slides on the left.
Hold on one second. Am I sharing the screen with the full screen? Is it a full slide or is it just?
It's just a slide, Andy, but it looks good. I can read everything.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate you introducing me, but also wanted to thank Emory for having me here tonight. Obviously, a little different situation as we face lots of different situations. I think we can all learn a lot from what we've been through over the last 6 months. Steve talked about the 6 pillars, and those are things that we kind of developed together and came up with a list of things that we thought were important to think about as you are managing a business during a crisis, and really, quite frankly, managing a business at any time. So I'll start with a brief background. I was a founder of a business with 2 partners that was founded in another crisis. It was founded in 2007 during the kind of the beginnings of the great financial crisis. And so when I ordered my 6 pillars, you'll notice they're slightly different than Steve's, but in terms of the order mostly, but also the wording. And I think the first was the importance of being fully funded and the access to capital and the concept that cash was king. And I think that was grounded in me probably right out of college. I graduated Emory in 1991. And there was a bit of a recession then. I then went to work in commercial real estate, saw the downturn, moved into a tech media telecom banking job, and saw the internet bubble burst. And I think that was the first time I heard the word fully funded. And I think coming out of that bubble bursting, Steve talked about having 2 years of cash available to make sure that you can kind of find your way through any crisis. And I think that's a good metric. I always looked at it and said, I want to be fully funded. I want to have enough capital. I want to raise enough capital that I'm not ever beholden to going back and raising capital, because it's important to have a well-capitalized business, and it's never more important than in a crisis. And so access to capital is often not there when you need it the most. So you need to make sure that you have enough for the tough times when times are good. And when you do face that crisis, obviously, first in my role as a manager of a business, making sure we were fully funded, but then now as an investor, helping mentor other businesses and other founders, one of the first things you need to do is tighten your belts to ensure that you see the other side of the storm. And so there's, as Steve said, 2 ways to do it. You can take on more capital, or if there's no capital available, you figure out ways to make it by with less than what you've had previously, and you tighten your belt. So one of the things we learned coming out of the first financial crisis was we raised $1 million, and we did it about a month. We raised $2 million when we founded our business, and then we raised another $1 million in 2008, just before Bear and Lehman declared bankruptcy. And so for us, the timing was critical, because had we not raised that additional $1 million, we wouldn't have had the capital to ride through what was then a pretty big storm. And I think similarly during this most recent crisis in the companies that I was advising, we were actively out there either attempting to access the PPP and the government funded programs, as well as trying to raise additional capital to make sure that we saw the other side of this crisis. So I'm going to show a quick slide that maybe tells you why it was so important for us. And I can't, I'm not saying that this was the company that I ran, but I'm not saying that it wasn't either. And it shows a pretty flat revenue line in the early years during that financial crisis. And as you can see, oh, you know what? I'm not sure if that, let me see are you seeing, perfect. Hopefully now you're seeing it. I'm showing a graph now that shows kind of a title called Path to Success Appears Smooth. And in that, what you're seeing is really small revenues in the early years, and much larger revenues as as time passes. And so for us, raising that capital and being fully funded and having enough to get us through the tough times was critical, because had we not gotten to 2011, as you can see in this graph, there never would have been a successful outcome. And, you know, the business today is going to cross $100 million this year for the first time. And so what you can see is a business that was barely doing 4 million for the first 4 years, you know, really pivoted and grew only because we raised that last million. Had we not raised that last million, I can assure you we wouldn't have been able to even get to 2011 and through that first crisis. So that's the reason why I always start with the fully funded concept as the pillar. I also have another slide that I think, you know, kind of shows analogy similar to, let's see, that was not showing. Are you seeing the graph here? Because I'm not sure if it's.
Yeah, and you've got the slide on success where straight line versus you know, kind of a bunch of spaghetti.
Perfect. All right. So the spaghetti wasn't showing on my screen. So there's, by the way, there's some irony that I was a CEO of a technology company, and I'm not particularly good at technology. So I'm glad you guys get to witness that with me. But I think Steve talked about the captain and being calm, cool, and collected. And I like to show these two slides back to back, because I think people think that the path to success is really straightforward and clear, much like Steve talked about the captain being calm, cool, and collected at the helm of the ship. I always talk about the duck that's swimming along a lake, and it appears to be gliding along effortlessly, when in fact below the surface there's a lot of churning going on. And I think the spaghetti also shows kind of the similar concept that when you're managing a business and the day-to-day is anything but calm, it is important to remain calm, cool, and collected, and kind of remember that you want to point yourself in the direction you're trying to go, and not overly stress over the highs and lows of any given day, given the fact that at any point in time it can look like a mess of spaghetti. And ultimately, if you have the right team and the right people and the right passion, often you will end up where you want to be. So I think the next slide I talk about is the next concept after being fully funded is the people. People and culture are absolutely critical, never more so than in a crisis. And when we talked about our key, I guess, kind of core competencies, or our culture that we wanted to think about, we had about 20 things that we thought were important. We ultimately boiled it down to what we called fit. Fit for us was fun, innovative, and transparent. And I think the fun part is just wanting to make sure that you like what you're doing. People always say you're gonna be successful when you find a job that actually pays you money to do what you enjoy doing. Innovative is critical to kind of what we're talking about now, the flexibility to be agile and pivot when life throws at you challenges you were not foreseeing. And then the third is the transparent. And the transparent is really incredibly key, establishing that as a component of your culture, because transparency, along with excellent communication, is what you will want and what you will need to make sure that the team is on the same page. And when you're in an office, it's easy to, kind of manage by walking around and, as Steve said, make sure you're checking in and taking the temperature of the teammates and making sure you understand how people are. But when you're faced with a pandemic like we were just faced with, obviously you have to find other ways to manage. And, I obviously had an experience where I was physically located here in Charlotte, and my business was headquartered in San Diego. Our largest office was in New York. We had a big presence in London, and then developers throughout the world in India and Costa Rica. So I was used to managing a global business with a lot of travel, but as well over conference calls and video conferences and the like. The good news was that I experienced and I found out about Zoom, and we used Zoom as a client many years ago. So I invested in Zoom during the IPO and was an investor during this pandemic. And at one point, I think it might have been the only investment I was in that was actually in the green when we were late March, early April. But I think that the idea with the people and the culture and the fit is just, it's how important it is to really first, I guess, focus on health and safety of your team, and then think about the health and safety of your customers. And once you ensure that, then you can kind of start to pivot and start thinking about, okay, now how do we respond to a crisis like this? Steve mentioned empathy, critical word. It's something that we always tested our team with before we hired anyone, and there was a test that they took. We did multiple parts of interviewing and hiring people, and it started with obviously a resume-based interview, moved into testing to kind of understand their personality and whether they how they learned and how they thought and how they would do their job. And then the last component of our hiring process was what we called the fit interview, and it was just as it sounded. It was a personality where you got together for coffee, lunch, or drinks with the team that you'd be working with and the candidate to make sure that there was a good fit within the team. The next piece, after you've kind of got the funding down and you start to get the right people, let's see if I skipped is innovation. And that's obviously the topic of focus today. Change and crises like the one we had in 2007 and the one we're experiencing today create opportunity and create adrenaline for innovation. And so things that took days, weeks, months, years, the timelines are compressed and can be solved so much quicker. And so I think from an agility and innovation standpoint, the keys are really to identify the opportunities that are happening based on your kind of shifting landscape, and then adapt your core to make sure that you're meeting the needs of that changing consumer behavior, or it can say changing consumer needs. Once you've done that, then you can kind of reevaluate your new initiative portfolio and really make large investments that will strengthen your business in the post-crisis recovery. And I think when we looked at what happened to us in the 07 to 09 timeframe, we invested significantly in solving a problem that was highlighted by the great financial crisis. And now I think similarly in the pandemic, you're seeing examples of that. And I think you saw beer makers and distillers shifting production to hand sanitizers. I have an Emory classmate and friend who runs a large industrial business that makes fire and heat retardant clothing, and they shifted to develop PPE for healthcare and other uses. And so it's really important that you're innovative and agile, but in order to do that, you have to make sure that you've identified kind of what shifts are occurring and adapting your core to kind of change to meet those changing needs. I talked, and Steve did as well, about uniting around a purpose and following your passion and persevering. It's obviously setbacks are expected and okay, and nothing nothing creates there's a massive spike in energy around a crisis. And so what you can do in a crisis is you can use that energy to kind of unite around a shared purpose. And obviously successful businesses create a purpose that enables their employees to feel passionate about what they do. And so while you don't want to use a crisis use a negative for, in a bad way, you can use the shared perspective and the shared concern to create unity around a purpose. And obviously, once you take care of your team, you ensure your team is healthy, safe, and you've adjusted for that. then you can use that energy and a new way of looking at life to help grow your business. So that, that's an important pillar that we've talked about. And then I think the something like this is a great example of how you need to lean into your network. You need to develop your network over the good times so that when you need it, it's there for you. And I think when people realize that other people are dealing with the same issues as you are, you can often learn from one another. I've always loved sharing, coffee, lunch, or drinks with other entrepreneurs and talking about their business challenges, because oftentimes I learn as much as I am able to give in terms of hearing how they're solving challenges and problems. And this pandemic was a great example. I'm going to share with you in just a moment a story I actually read today about a company in terms of how they leaned into their network to help solve their problems. And then the last piece, the last pillar really is technology. And so I run a technology company, or did, and invest in many technology companies today. And so you'd think a technology company would have a real focus on great technology, and certainly we did. But when a crisis hits, you're forced to kind of confront the truth about what your processes are, how they're working, and how they don't. And things become glaringly obvious when they're not working in a crisis. And so I think the last, I think I'll close by just saying, I read something in the Times just today talking about a retailer and how they adapted and thrived in this pandemic. And it just kind of felt very appropriate for what we were talking about. And the company is Snipes. And I'm not sure if anyone has read the article or is familiar with Snipes, but they pivoted as an organization, and they literally did it in 2 days post-pandemic. When the coronavirus started to spread, they kind of redirected their merchandise from stores to an online shipment warehouse, and the workers packing the delivery orders were all split into groups to kind of isolate any coronavirus infections. So they were agile, they were innovative, and they pivoted quickly. And this is obviously a retailer. When you think about the industries that have been crushed in this pandemic, retail is probably top of mind, along with travel, leisure, and entertainment. Some of the industries obviously Steve is working in. They actually came up with the idea from what they called a COVID sucks roundtable, which was a gathering of executives from rival companies who teamed up to share ideas for how to handle their business. So they leaned into their network in a way that that helped them even collaborate with competitors in a because you were all trying to solve for the same, you had that shared purpose. And then they used technology to streamline their online purchases. When their stores were closed, their software buckled. They sped up their website, and they made their shopping process faster. And they used things to help them discern what were and were not fraudulent card purchases, and started giving people pop-up messages based on their location as to whether and how, what stores and what hours were open. So just a great example of a retail, and that's a large retailer, pivoting and taking advantage of some of these pillars. And they went from 10% of their business online to over 20% on an ongoing basis. So they doubled the percentage of online orders, and they're actually ahead of plan in 2020, ahead of their original budget. So while you hear horror stories about all the businesses that have struggled, certainly there was one example of a business that didn't. So with that, I will turn it back to my favorite slide and open up the screen for questions and comments.
Thanks, Andy. Really appreciate all of that. So we are going to get into the Q&A. I have a handful of questions that I took down during both Andy and Steve's presentations, but anyone who's listening, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A. If you go ahead and put it in there, I will see those and I can bring those up. But I think both of you hit on several topics, and a question for both of you, and something that I've seen personally in my own work experience. But I think a big factor of COVID, of forcing everyone to work remotely, I think in many instances it exposed kind of companies and organizations and what their own internal tech stack was. So just for both of you, would be interested to hear kind of what holes has COVID exposed and what have you guys done since then to adapt?
Andy, you want to go first?
I'm going to let you go first. I was reading the webinar chat, I'll be honest, so I'm going to pivot off of you.
No problem. So I think, Scott, from the AUDL's perspective, is that, we realized that we had focused too much on just being live entertainment. And, back to the comment of just, we learned that we really are content. And, I think we can, as we think about, entertaining ourselves, when you watch a movie, you're not watching a movie live, right? Clearly that movie was put together as content that you're enjoying, and it can make you feel happy, it can make you feel sad, but you enjoy spending 2 hours on that content. And so that's what we learned. And that, again, this COVID crisis forced us to step back, blank sheet of paper, what are we really doing as a business and what are our strengths? So when we understood that we're content providers, then again, let's see when we can take maybe old content, recycle it, dress it up, reconfigure it in a way that's entertaining to people. And that's the way you keep your fan base excited, and you keep them around until you get back to maybe what your true core is. And for us, that's live entertainment.
So I take it to the question was kind of what have we learned from this crisis and how we pivoted?
I think kind of specifically, did it expose anything in kind of your internal tech stack? So I personally work in the commercial real estate industry and, sell software, and, many firms, when you couldn't go to the office, all of a sudden they couldn't write people checks or deposit checks, or, how do I now pay vendors, because they were doing all of that manually. So by having COVID shut everyone out and, everyone's remote, there were just a lot of kind of manual things that were exposed. And since then, people have started to accelerate whatever tech plans they had. So just curious on kind of your end, if there was anything like that.
Sure. I actually, being a technology business, we invested significantly in technology. We also had a very liberal work from home policy even prior to the pandemic. I think this has highlighted to people how productive and how capable people are of working from home. So for us, I'd say that what we learned is it really benefited our business and a lot of the businesses I work with, because it highlighted to our customers how much they needed to invest in technology. And so being a technology business, and I think you've probably seen it, I mentioned kind of the stock market and how the whole portfolio was red, and then all of a sudden, Zoom was the only green. Well, you've seen the market come back, and you've seen the tech sector take off, largely because people have really had an understanding of how important that technology is to handling their business on a daily, and so when you had, in our particular world, in the financial services world, where you had a portfolio manager and a trader and a compliance person who were all able to be on the same trading desk, who could kind of look over the screen at one another, you might be able to get by with okay technology. You could ask someone a question. This became a much more, it became much more apparent how important that technology was to our clients. And so for us, we didn't experience that as much in our operations, as much as we actually saw a pickup in the amount of acceptances of new demos, conversions of existing clients. And so our book of business increased throughout the pandemic and has continued to do so almost at record pace, largely because I think other businesses have discovered just how important the technology is to their way of life.
Makes sense. We have a question from the audience. So Steve, you mentioned empathy and checking in with employees to ensure good communication. Any best practices for that as you manage growth and your employee base increases significantly?
Yes. So, I think the leadership team for the AUDL some of us are wired better than others to, normally take time out to see, how people are doing. But again, as I mentioned, I'm an engineer by undergrad education. So genetically, I think I'm predisposed to not doing that well. So what I've had to do is to really put that almost as a tickler list. So what I try to do now is, when I have a Zoom call, or whether I have a phone call with someone, as we're all working remotely, I almost make sure to take time out in that conversation to ask about how they're doing, pick up on something I know personally that's going on in their life as part of the conversation around the business topic for that particular meeting or call. And again, I try to check in with people because I think, as Andy was saying, we've had different types of crises. And I think the COVID crisis is different because it's not just, the stress of trying to succeed in your business plan and all the stress that comes from that, but we're having these new stresses from family, medical that are hitting everybody. So I really try to literally, even if it's just 5 seconds, ask how someone's doing. And that gives them a chance, if they're hurting, to really open up. And I find that goes a long way to create loyalty and to get someone to want to be a part of your business over the long run.
I couldn't agree more, Steve. And I will tell you, that was one of the biggest challenges I faced as our business grew. I showed kind of one of the slides that talked about, revenues, clients, employees. Until we crossed about 100 employees, I knew everyone by name, and not only knew them by name, but knew their spouse or their kids' names and their interests and the things that were important to them. And so I used what I described as the management by walking around. Every time I was in a particular office, I would literally just schedule time to make sure I stopped by and talked to the team, understood what was going on in both their work and their lives. It's a lot easier to do in person, but what you have to do is figure out how to do it in this new world remotely over a Zoom. But one thing that doesn't scale. And so what I realized as we crossed 100 and then crossed 200, we now have over 550 employees. And I long ago stopped pretending that I actually knew everyone by name as much as I wished I did. I would say that we did things like we'd have order pizzas into the lunchroom and have different groups sit down and talk in smaller groups because it became physically impossible to actually sit down and talk individually with everyone in the company, or that would have been the only thing I did. And so that's part of the challenge of scaling a business is at some point you can't do what you did when you were 10, 12, 25, or even 100 employees. So what you do is you put a great team in place, and you ensure that that your team believes in the same empathy and the same kind of philosophy and culture that you do. And that's why those first hires are so critical, is making sure that those managers and leaders are doing the things that you used to do as the leader of a smaller business.
Those are both great answers. You guys both also touched on networking being a really critical aspect to making it through a crisis. So was just curious if either of you have any good examples over the last 6 months of kind of someone that you reached out to and how they helped you and your organization, or kind of vice versa, someone reached out to you and you were able to assist them.
Well, Andy, you want to go?
Yeah, I was going to say, a couple of Zooms, we'd have those Zoom happy hours, and we, a couple different groups emerged. One was my high school friends, one was my college friends, one was my business school friends. So since it's the Emory session, I'll talk about my college friends. And, I had I mentioned one of my friends who ran a business in Cleveland, Ohio, and another friend has another business in Austin, Texas. And they're both in I'd say the clothing and apparel, but one is, much more industrial. One is much more, it was for firemen and firewomen, fire retardant clothing and industrial use in terms of heat repellent clothing. And the other is a kind of a Nike distributor business that does Nike, like Olympics non-revenue Olympic sports for Nike. And so he does things like wrestling and volleyball, some of the businesses that are not as big and glamorous as, say, football and basketball, but still big businesses nonetheless. And so we had our Emory kind of Zoom happy hour going, and we all collectively were trying to solve the problem of our friend whose industrial use clients had completely shut down, and our other friend whose sporting event clients had completely shut down because kind of kids sports and group sports were completely shut down. And so we collectively were helping them and brainstorming with them around how they could pivot, how they could innovate, and how they could change their business models to get them through the storm. And so while we were drinking wine or beer and hanging out on Zoom, we were also kind of sharing ideas and spitballing things that might work. And both businesses, while off significantly from where they plan to be, are surviving and doing well and positioned to take advantage of a return to some sort of normalcy.
Yeah, I'll pick up on this. I think a lot of our professional networks are terrific, but I'll give you a somewhat embarrassing story that sometimes your family can be a great network and will help you and force you to think completely differently. So back on Ultimate is that we think of ourselves as live entertainment first and foremost. But again, we're entertainment. How do you get people just to be excited about a sport that, again, for Ultimate, people kind of know it, but again, it's not one of the big ones, the major 4 or 5. So as you all can imagine, I've got 2 boys, a 19-year-old who loves his FIFA, entertainment games. And so literally sitting on the couch and, months and months ago saying, boy, gosh, we've got a tough decisions coming up on what we do. And he's sitting there playing FIFA, I think half listening to me, half not. And he said, well, Dad, you guys got to do a video game for Ultimate. That'd be really cool. And he goes back to playing FIFA. And we said, well, holy smokes, that's a brilliant idea. Again, how do we get people engaged? It's entertainment. It's, if we could figure out how to show someone throwing a Frisbee in a FIFA type environment, again, it's entertainment. It's not live, but again, it's that same kind of core content about a sport that people would like. And as many hours as I've seen him play FIFA, if I can convince him to do an Ultimate game, we've got something. So, and we had kicked around somewhat of some ideas, but we had not thought about FIFA as a core business, console game. So, even little things like that, where, he's almost in a sense a client, getting somebody who's not deep in the weeds, sometimes just look at your business completely differently, can be terrific. And so, someone embarrassing, my 19-year-old may have set us up for the biggest revenue opportunity we'll ever have, can be a neat opportunity sometimes.
Not embarrassing at all. That's super cool. That's awesome.
So I think kind of one last question, maybe room for one additional beyond that, but both of you really emphasized, being well capitalized and, not having to ask for money when you need it most and when you're most desperate. So again, going over the last 6 months, what did each of you and maybe the firms that you guys work with do to stay well capitalized? And kind of a carry on to that was, did either of you raise any money in the last 6 months? And if so, what that process was like?
I can tell you right now, we are about to launch, so I can't give you the deep details, but, you have to be, as I said, I think you have to be humble. And, I think none of us like giving up ownership of companies. We like to retain as much as possible because that's going to maximize our economics. But I think, Andy showed a great slide that you have to be humble. You have to swallow your pride and realize that, if you don't make it, over the next quarter or two, you could potentially kiss the company goodbye. So you'd be willing to raise out, be willing to get flexible on the sources of capital that come in and who they might come in, the types of people that might invest in your business. So we're literally about to raise more capital for both the league and our teams. And it's going to be interesting. We're going to have to get creative. A lot of people are a little bit nervous, as you can imagine, about live entertainment. So we're having to reach out to new pockets that we hadn't thought about in the past.
And my old business we had just raised capital in the fall, so we were very well positioned from a capital perspective, and it's a cash flowing business. So we were somewhat lucky there. But some of the others that I'm on the boards of or invest in, I encouraged all of them to apply for the PPP loans. That was a great source of capital. It was an example of our government being creative and working together and coming up with a solution that made sense. So I encourage more of that from our government if anybody's listening. And then as well, I have at least 3 companies that I work with, 2 that I'm on the board of, have done capital raises during this time period. One of them did a down round, which is particularly tough to swallow from a owner perspective, to raise capital at a price point and an enterprise value below where you did your last round. And the other one did a flat round to what they had done about 2 years earlier, even though they were a significantly bigger business now. So both tough pills to swallow for the founders, but necessary to, as Steve said, get you to the other side and allow you to capitalize on the growth opportunities ahead.
And just a follow up to that, in those 2 examples, did they begin that process kind of pre-March, or was that post-March?
Those were both post-COVID, kind of holy, wow, we need to do something. Yeah, both.
Yeah, and I'd say just back to Andy made a great comment that your revenues are going to be stressed, then you better start looking really hard at your expenses. What's necessary? Where can we cut? And so, we did the forecast of, back in March, our fiscal year ends tomorrow. We said, well, how much cash do we think we're going to have in the bank by 9/30? Can you clear checks? Can you make some basic payments? And so we started thinking about, not if we're going to raise money, but how much and where. And so, I think today's world, there's a lot more creativity. You've got a lot of crowdfunding platforms, Start Engine, WeFunder, Republic. And so the crowdfunding in today's world, gives you a new source of capital versus kind of where Andy and I, kind of came from, the traditional institutional routes or, your friends and family. And so that's been great. And you still have things like Kickstarter out there, but, Kickstarter can only take you so far. So again, you've got to be creative as to where you might source your capital.
Well, I think we are about wrapped up, unless either of you have anything else you wanted to cover, but I really appreciate both Steve and Andy participating and everyone else joining on the call. We really enjoyed the conversation and being able to share with the rest of the Emory community.
Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate you giving us this opportunity.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks to Emory and thanks to you for moderating. Really hope everyone had a good time. And now we got another more interesting debate to watch.
Yeah. And Scott, I think Andy and I both said we'd be happy if people have questions afterwards to connect and help people as we can.
Yep. Yeah. Please share emails or contact information, or if you're out there, you want to hit us up on LinkedIn. Happy to do it.
Happy to do it.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Right.